Welcome to the second video from Paleo Mythbusters. Some stuff's changed, but the topic has also. Today, we're going to be looking at a personal favorite group of dinosaurs of mine. The Ceratopsians are a very well understood group of dinosaurs, and we see them all the time in movies. Jurassic Park, Walking with Dinosaurs, all of them have Ceratopsians in them. But a lot of them show them doing one thing, using their horns and ramming into objects or ramming into each other. But could Triceratops have actually done this? Let's find out. It's like 80 degrees outside right now, and my house, it's like 85 because of the humidity. It is hot right now. Whew, I'm sweating. Not important. So, when we're looking at the history of Ceratopsians, we need to cover the early part of that. When they were first being discovered, animals like Casimosaurus, Styracosaurus, and Triceratops, we paleontologists didn't really have a good idea on what these animals were like. Dinosaurs in general are just so new. T-Rex looked a lot different from how it's depicted now than how it was depicted during that time. So paleontologists didn't have a lot to go off of, especially because these were such unique animals. Actually, the first Triceratops specimen from a Triceratops horridus was originally believed to be a bison. I do not remember what bison species it was called, but O.C. Marsh, who was the paleontologist that found this specimen, dubbed it to be an ancient bison fossil. And in a lot of early paleontology, we see stuff like this happen. So, when these animals were first being found, because they looked so similar to a lot of modern animals such as elephants, rhinoceros, wildebeest, and bison, they kind of took the behaviors and quirks of those animals and applied them to Ceratopsians. This is actually still a trope that we find in a lot of different documentaries and also in a lot of different papers in paleontology. Some people see a Ceratopsian and they see the horns and they think, oh, it must act like other horned animals that we have today. That might not necessarily be true though. Topic for another time. So, during that time, during the time of the 1900s, it was believed that Ceratopsians might have actually just used their horns in a very similar fashion, ramming into different animals or each other. We see this in a lot of different early movies as well during the early 1900s, in like the 1930s and 50s, when stop motion was first becoming a thing. Movies such as King Kong, if I'm remembering correctly, The Lost World, and The Valley of Gwangi, great stop motion films, depicted different Ceratopsians ramming heads into either other animals or into each other. So this was just a common thing that was depicted, and it was something that was believed to be correct. But there was no actual fossil evidence for this during the time. How about now? The short answer is yeah. We have a lot of different fossils from the 80s through now that show that Triceratops especially would have been using their horns to fight with one another. In 14% of the skulls that we have from Triceratops specifically, we find multiple different injuries and pathologies, which are just marks in the skull or in bones in general, that could only be from other Ceratopsians. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they would have been ramming heads. This just shows that they would have been fighting. Although, we do see in a sister group, the Pachycephalosaurids, that they would have been ramming heads. This right here is my Pachycephalosaurus skull from a subadult, originally called Sticky Moloch. Now, we find that these animals would have 6-inch dome skulls, which is thicker than the rim of the top of my desk. So, packed with bone, these animals would have been ramming heads, and we also have direct fossil evidence. Just like with Ceratopsians, we find multiple different pathologies along this part of the skull right here, which would have shown, actually, I think this skull even shows it right here. Around here. Around here and here, this skull actually demonstrates that these animals would have been ramming heads with each other. But this doesn't necessarily mean a sister group would have been doing the same thing. The funny thing about phylogenetic bracketing is that a lot of different groups can evolve from one another. So Ceratopsians evolved differently than Pachycephalosaurids. They're still closely related, being sister groups, but that doesn't mean that we can take something from one group and apply it to another a lot of the time. So do we have any evidence similar to Pachycephalosaurs where we find these indentations in their skulls? Well, to find out if Ceratopsians, like Pachycephalosaurids, could have rammed heads, we would need to see if the skull could withstand such a pressure. And a documentary known as The Truth About Killer Dinosaurs did exactly this. They 3D printed a Triceratops skull using a material similar to bone and estimated how fast an adult female Triceratops could run. From there, they actually mounted the skull onto a machine, which then flew off and rammed into a brick wall. Do I think a brick wall is the equivalent to a T-Rex, which is what they were trying to find, or in our case, another Triceratops skull? No, but I do think it shows a really good point, which is that the skull would crack. Now, yeah, we do find that indentation in Pachycephalosaurus skulls, like I mentioned, but also like I mentioned, we're talking about a 6-inch thick skull. That is crazy dense and would mean that no harm would come to the brain. If a Triceratops tried to do the same thing a Pachycephalosaurus did, more likely than not, the Triceratops would crack its skull open and would die from a brain hemorrhage. So they would not have been doing this in the slightest. So we can officially say that the idea that Triceratops would have been using its head, or Ceratopsians in general, would have been using their heads to ram into one another is just downright wrong. And we can also find this in many other different skulls from Ceratopsians. Eniasaurus, Chasmosaurus, like I mentioned earlier, are Ceratopsians which don't have the exact horn structures that would have necessarily been needed to fight one another. So Ceratopsians weren't just using these horns of theirs for fighting. They were a majority of the time used as a sexual display structure. What we find with a lot of different dinosaurs, Ceratopsians, Pachycephalosaurids, Stegosaurids, Therizinosaurids, Spinosaurids, Hadrosaurs, we find that unlike modern birds who use their feathers for display structures, we see that dinosaurs, well, non-avian dinosaurs, I should say, spent a lot of their energy and a lot of focus on bone display structures, where the bone would act as like a peacock's fan in the case of like a Spinosaurus. So we see this also happening with Ceratopsians. Those giant frills of theirs were perfect and likely in life would have had beautiful colors on them. And in a lot of different paleo art, we see that they are depicted with false eyes to scare away predators. It's so cool that we have this evidence, and it just goes to show that these animals were a lot more complex than just lizard bulls, which I think dumbs down how amazing and truly complex these creatures were. But we know that some of them still would have been fighting. So how did Ceratopsians fight one another? Because again, we do find in 14% of Triceratops skulls specifically, there are injuries. And in other animals as well, in other Ceratopsians, we do find pathologies in their skulls and around their bodies. Well, to find that out, we're gonna need to take another trip to the Museum of Natural History. We're looking at this specimen of an unknown Triceratops species. Let's zoom in right here into the center of the skull. Now, although this little bit of bone doesn't look like much to you viewers at home, it is actually the key to understanding how these animals fought each other. This is what paleontologists call, and other biologists, a ball and socket joint. This would have allowed Triceratops and Styracosaurus to move their heads in a 360 fashion. Now, you probably don't really understand what that means, but I want you all at home to put your hands in this fashion right here. Now, I want you to move your hand exactly like how I am. This is the exact motion that old Ceratopsians would have been able to do thanks to their ball and socket joint. It's the exact same one that we have in our wrists. It's pretty cool. But this goes further on to show that Triceratops would not have been ramming into each other like elephants, rhinos, wildebeests, or rams, but instead would have been more fencing animals. Instead of ramming into one another, they would have tried to stab each other in the throat, or try to stab any unlucky Tyrannosaurus trying to hunt them. That's it for today's video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.